My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 76 years old, a white woman with pale, freckled skin that has weathered into soft lines, and hair that was once the deep brown of walnut shells but has now surrendered to silver. I was born and raised in a small coastal town in Maine, where the scent of salt water clung to your clothes and the cry of gulls was the constant backdrop to your life. These days, I live in a quiet house on the edge of a sleepy neighborhood, where the seasons pass without much fuss, and the walls seem to listen more than they speak. My husband has been gone for many years, my children scattered in different states, and the rhythms of my days are slow and solitary. This morning was meant to be simple, nothing more than a bit of spring cleaning in the attic with my granddaughter Lily, who is 16, curious to the point of mischief, and blessed with that unshakable energy youth carries like a birthright. Dust motes spun in the shafts of light streaming through the small attic window as we worked, pulling out boxes I had not touched in decades. She knelt beside an old cedar chest and pushed it aside to reach a smaller box hidden behind it, one I had placed there with intention many years ago. The box was a plain thing, once white, but now the shade of aged parchment, its lid secured with a fraying blue ribbon I had tied myself. I knew immediately what it was, before she even set it on the floor between us, and my breath caught in a way I could not disguise. She looked at me with those bright, questioning eyes that seemed to see more than they should, and with the innocent authority of the young, she asked if she could open it. I wanted to tell her no, to tuck it back into its shadowed corner and pretend she had never found it. But my voice failed me. So I watched her fingers work at the ribbon until it fell loose, the bow collapsing like a sigh. The lid came off, and the scent of old paper and time itself rose up, carrying me backward in an instant. Inside were letters, each one folded with care, their envelopes yellowed and thinning at the edges, the ink on the addresses softened by age. They were stacked neatly as though waiting for someone who had simply stepped out of the room and would return at any moment to claim them. On each, the handwriting was the same, the curves and angles so familiar to me they felt like an extension of my own skin. And there, in the bottom right corner of each envelope, was the name I had not spoken aloud in over half a century. Edward. My pulse quickened, a low thrum in my ears, because the moment she lifted the first letter, I knew the quiet world I had built around myself was about to shift. I had never meant for her, or anyone, to find them. Lily sat cross-legged on the attic floor, her fingers lightly tracing the faded ink on the envelope, as though she could feel the weight of the words inside, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were wide, brimming with the kind of curiosity that has no patience for hesitation. "Who's Edward?" she asked, the syllables soft yet unflinching, and the sound of that name pulled something deep and buried from within me, as if she had opened a door I had bricked over long ago. I felt my breath catch, and for a moment the dusty air seemed too thick to breathe. My mind flung backward in time to the summer of 1964, when the world was brighter, and the future seemed like something I could hold in my hands. In that instant, I was no longer a 76-year-old grandmother in a quiet house on the edge of town, but a 19-year-old girl standing in a salt-scented library, watching a young man in a navy coat smile at me over a stack of books. I realized, with a jolt that made my pulse quicken, that I had not heard his name spoken aloud in over 50 years, and the sound of it now felt like a tide rising without warning, pulling me off the shore I had clung to for so long. My mouth opened, but no words came, and Lily tilted her head the way she does when she knows I am holding something back, her patience mixing with a quiet determination that reminded me so much of her mother at that age. I wanted to tell her the truth, right then, to hand her the whole story in one breath, and let the years between then and now collapse completely. But the memories were tangled with joy and regret, love and loss, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to untangle them yet. "It's a long story," I managed finally, my voice low, each word carrying the weight of decades, and she smiled as though she knew that only made her want to hear it more. I told her I wasn't sure I was ready to tell it, that some things live in the shadows for a reason, but she just held the letter in her hands as if it were fragile and precious, her thumb brushing the paper like a promise she wouldn't force me before I was willing. The attic felt suddenly smaller, the light slanting through the window more golden, the air thick with the scent of old cedar and forgotten summers, and I knew there was no stopping what had been set in motion. Once a story begins to stir after being silent for so long, it starts to breathe on its own, and whether I was ready or not, the letters were already speaking for me. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the questions in her eyes not just about Edward, but about who I had been before I was her grandmother. And I understood that the past I had kept sealed was no longer entirely mine. It was the summer of 1964, and I was 19, with the kind of restless hope that clings to you before the world teaches you to temper it. I worked at the small library in our seaside town, a place that always smelled faintly of paper and salt from the sea breeze that found its way in through the cracked windows. The days were slow, the sound of pages turning and the occasional hush of footsteps across worn wooden floors marking the hours, and I thought my life would always be some variation of that quiet rhythm. Then, one rainy afternoon, he walked in. The door opened with a soft chime, and Edward stepped inside as though the storm outside had been sent to carry him to that exact moment. He was tall, his navy coat glistening with rain, droplets clinging to the edges of his dark hair. There was something about the way he looked around, as if he belonged there, but was still taking everything in, that made my hands still over the stack of returns I had been sorting. He smelled faintly of salt and ink, a strange but comforting combination, and when his eyes met mine, I felt a flicker of recognition, even though I was certain I had never seen him before. He walked to the counter and, in a voice both steady and warm, asked if I could help him find poetry books, specifically ones that spoke of the sea. His words were careful, as if he had thought about them before speaking, and I found myself wanting to hear them again. I led him to the far corner where the poetry section lived, and as we walked between the shelves, I was aware of the closeness of the space, the soft patter of rain against the windows, and the distant cry of gulls beyond the walls. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books as though each one might hold a secret, and when he pulled one from the shelf, he asked if I had a favorite poem. No one had ever asked me that before, and the question lodged itself in my chest in a way I couldn't quite name. I told him about a piece I loved, about how it spoke of tides and longing, and he smiled in a way that made me feel as though he understood far more than I was saying. We spoke quietly for several minutes, and when he left, the space he had occupied seemed to hum with his absence. I did not know then that a single moment could set into motion 1,000 more, that the man in the navy coat would become the keeper of my heart, or that his name, spoken decades later, would still have the power to stop my breath. All I knew that day was that the rain had brought him to me, and I was already different for it. In the weeks that followed that first rainy afternoon, Edward became as much a part of the library as the scent of old paper and the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet, appearing almost every day with a new question or request that felt less like necessity and more like an excuse to linger near me. Sometimes he would ask for books on maritime history, other times a collection of sonnets, And on more than one occasion, he returned the same book he had borrowed just days earlier, claiming he had forgotten to finish it, though I suspected it was simply a way to see me again. There was a quiet thrill in those encounters, a kind of unspoken understanding that something was growing between us, though neither of us had given it voice. Then, one afternoon, as I was reshelving a stack of returns, my fingers paused on the spine of a worn anthology of poetry. I pulled it out to check the binding, and, as I opened it, a folded scrap of paper slid to the floor. The paper was cream-coloured, soft at the edges from handling, and when I unfolded it, I found a few short lines written in a hand I recognized instantly. The ink was a deep blue, the letters formed with care, each curve deliberate, and though it bore no signature, I knew without question it was from Edward. It was a poem, simple but haunting, about the pull of the sea and the ache of longing for something just out of reach. I stood there for a long moment, the sound of the rain outside mingling with the echo of those words in my head. My thumb brushing over the loops and strokes of his writing, as though the touch might bring him closer. There was no instruction, no invitation, no question, only the quiet offering of his thoughts. But I felt as if he had placed a key in my hand. That evening, when I closed the library, I wrote a reply on a slip of paper torn from the back of my notebook, a few lines about the comfort of steady shores and the beauty of storms. And the next morning, I slipped it between the pages of a book I knew he would borrow. This was how it began, our unspoken arrangement, words hidden between pages, the exchange of thoughts that belonged to no one but us. The library became our meeting ground, though often we never spoke more than a handful of words aloud, relying instead on these secret missives that passed from one set of hands to the other without witness. Each note was a thread, weaving something fragile and beautiful between us. And as the days passed, I found myself listening for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, watching for the moment his shadow would fall across the doorway, carrying with it the possibility of another letter, another piece of himself left quietly for me to find. I told Lily about the nights when the world felt like it belonged only to us, when the library lights had long gone dark and the town's streets lay hushed beneath a quilt of salt air and shadow, and Edward would be waiting for me at the end of the lane, his hands tucked into the pockets of his navy coat. That same faint scent of salt and ink rising from him like a familiar song. We would walk to the pier, the planks beneath our feet weathered and creaking softly with each step, the sound of the tide folding and unfolding against the shore like the slow breath of something ancient. The moon would cast a silver path across the waves, and sometimes it seemed as if it were inviting us to follow it to wherever it ended, somewhere far beyond the reach of our little town. Edward would lean against the rail, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he spoke of the places he had seen and the places he still longed to go, painting them for me in colours so vivid I could almost hear the bustling markets of distant cities and smell the spices drifting on foreign winds. He told me of narrow cobblestone streets in villages clinging to the edges of cliffs, of mountains whose peaks disappeared into clouds, of waters so clear you could see the ripple of fish passing below as if the sea itself were made of glass. I listened, hungry for every detail, my mind stretching far beyond the shoreline I had always known, and when he asked about my dreams, I told him the truth in pieces small enough to hand over without revealing how much of my heart they carried. I spoke of wanting to write, to put into words the beauty and sorrow I saw in the world around me, to capture fleeting moments the way the sea holds light for only an instant before letting it slip away. I told him I wanted to see more than the pages of books could offer, though I did not confess that when I pictured myself in these imagined landscapes, I saw him there beside me. There was a gentleness in the way he listened, as if every word I spoke was a shell worth turning over carefully in his palm. And there were nights when our conversations stretched into the early hours without either of us noticing how much time had passed. The stars above seemed closer on those walks, the night air cool and steady, and sometimes the only sound was the water moving beneath us and the unspoken knowledge that we were treading a line between friendship and something deeper. I told Lily that in those moments, it felt as if the pier, the moonlight, the sea, and even the air itself conspired to hold us in that fragile space. And though I never dared to hope he might be part of my future, a quiet part of me already knew I would never forget him. I explained to Lily that ours was a love that bloomed more on paper than in the open air, that the truest parts of what we felt for each other were hidden inside folded pages rather than spoken aloud where others might hear. In the town where I grew up, the lines of propriety were drawn deep and clear, and stepping over them could carry consequences that reached far beyond whispers. Edward was tied to the expectations of his family, to a business that would one day require his full attention, and I was bound by the unspoken rules that governed the life of a young woman whose worth was measured by her modesty and obedience. So we found our way through ink and paper, our hands delivering what our mouths dared not say. The letters began as small exchanges, a few lines slipped between the pages of borrowed books, but soon they grew into longer confessions, stretching over pages where the margins seemed to ache with what we left unsaid. His handwriting was bold yet careful, the loops of his letters graceful, the lines pressed deep enough into the page that I could feel the indentations when I ran my fingers over them. In those letters, he spoke of longing and of the way he thought of me when he stood on the shore, the waves rushing toward his boots, how he imagined my hand in his when he saw something beautiful, how he feared that one day distance might undo what we had built. In my replies, I told him of the way I counted the hours between his visits, of the sound of his voice lingering in my mind like a song I could not stop humming, of how the sight of his handwriting felt like the opening of a window in a room I hadn't realized was stifling. We never spoke of these things aloud. In person, we remained careful, our conversations gentle and often guarded, our eyes doing the work our words could not. It was safer that way, in a time and place where the truth of what we felt might be met with disapproval or worse. The letters became our refuge, a private world where we could be unashamed of the depth of our feelings, where each sentence was a bridge drawing us closer. I told Lily that I kept them all in a box even then, tied with the same ribbon she had seen that day in the attic, because I knew even at 19 that these pages were more than just words. They were the truest record of who we were together, of the moments we dared to dream beyond the limits set for us. And though the rest of the world never saw the way we loved, those letters held the proof that it was real, as steady and undeniable as the tide. By late summer, the air had begun to carry that faint edge of coolness that hinted at the coming change, and it was on one of those evenings, when the light stretched long and golden over the water, that Edward told me he would be leaving. We were sitting on the pier, our elbows resting on the weathered rail, the tide moving lazily below us. When he said the words, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could already see the path that would take him away. An overseas assignment, he explained, the kind of opportunity his family expected him to take, and though he spoke of it with a mix of duty and excitement, I felt a slow heaviness settle in my chest. He promised to write from every port, to tell me of the places he visited, the colours of foreign markets, the taste of food I had never heard of, and I believed him. But beneath the promise, there was the quiet pull of inevitability, The truth that distance changes things, no matter how tightly we try to hold on. That night, after he walked me home, I stood at my bedroom window and watched the moon rise over the water, thinking about how the same moon would hang above him wherever he went, and how that might be the closest we would be once he left. His letters began arriving soon after his departure, the envelopes postmarked from cities whose names felt exotic and distant on my tongue. In each, he wrote as if I were walking beside him, describing the shape of the streets, the smell of the harbours, the sound of unfamiliar languages drifting through open windows. I read them slowly, more than once, tracing the lines of his handwriting until they became as familiar as the sound of the waves I heard every night. And yet, as much as his words reached me, there was an ache between them, a growing awareness that letters could only carry so much of a person. I would fold them carefully, return them to their envelopes, and place them in the box where the others waited, each one both a comfort and a reminder of the space widening between us. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, I would imagine him in those faraway places, his face lit by the same sun I would see rise hours later, and I wondered if he pictured me as often as I pictured him. The days passed, and though the rhythm of his letters never faltered, I began to understand that distance was not just measured in miles, but in the way the world around each of us shifted while we were apart. I told Lily that even then, I sensed we were moving toward an ending neither of us wanted to name, that the shadow of goodbye had already begun to stretch across the water, long before either of us spoke the word. It was an autumn afternoon when the letter arrived, and I remember the way the air felt that day, crisp and cool, with the faint scent of wood smoke drifting in from the chimneys along the street. I had grown used to the sight of his handwriting on the envelopes, the way my heart would quicken just slightly at the postman's knock. But this one was different. It was heavier in my hand, the paper thick and firm, and instead of the usual flap sealed with a dab of glue, the back was closed with a circle of deep red wax, pressed smooth with a mark I could not quite make out. I sat at the small desk in my bedroom, turning it over in my hands, tracing the edges, and for a long moment I simply stared at it, unable to bring myself to break the seal. I told myself I was only waiting for the right moment, that I wanted to be alone and unhurried when I read it. But the truth was far simpler and far more difficult to admit. I was afraid. I had learned to live for his letters, to let them carry me across oceans and into the shape of his days. But a letter like this felt like something final. It had weight, not just in my hand, but in my chest, and I feared that inside it waited the words I had been trying not to imagine since the day he left. I feared it would tell me he would not be coming back, that his life had taken a turn away from mine, that the thread between us had finally frayed beyond repair. So instead of opening it, I placed it gently in the box with all the others, sliding it to the very bottom as if burying it could keep its contents from becoming real. Days passed, then weeks, and I told myself each time I saw the box that I would open it soon, but I never did. I kept writing to him, kept sending my words out into the unknown, and his replies continued to arrive, filled with stories of the places he travelled, the seas he crossed, the people he met. I never asked about the sealed letter, and he never mentioned it, as if we had silently agreed to leave that one thing untouched. Over the years, I would think about it from time to time, wondering if it truly was the end I feared, or if it might have been something entirely different, a truth that could have changed everything. But I left it as it was, unread, because sometimes the possibility of a different ending is easier to live with than the certainty of the one that is written. I told Lily that the unopened envelope is still there in the box, its seal unbroken, the red wax darkened with age. a silent testament to the choice I made that day to let fear decide for me. I told Lily that life has a way of carrying you forward, whether your heart is ready or not. And after Edward, I let the tide take me where it would. I married a good man, one who worked hard and treated me with kindness, and together we built the sort of life people around us considered respectable. There were years when my days were full from morning until night, with the cries of babies, the clatter of dishes, the scent of bread rising in the oven, the steady hum of responsibilities that leave little room for wistful dreaming. I found contentment in small things, the first blossoms of spring, the sound of my children's laughter spilling down the hall, the warmth of my husband's hand at my back when we walked home from church. On the surface, I had everything a young woman in our town was taught to want, yet there were moments, often in the quiet before sleep, or when a certain shade of blue caught my eye, when Edward's face would rise unbidden in my mind. His letters remained with me through it all, packed neatly in the same box, tied with the same ribbon, untouched but never out of reach. They moved with me from one home to the next, tucked away in closets and drawers, their presence a silent thread binding me to a chapter I had never truly closed. I never spoke of them, not to my husband, not to my children, because they belonged to a part of myself I could not explain without unraveling the life I had chosen. Years passed, decades even, and I played the roles expected of me: mother, wife, neighbor, hostess, never letting anyone see that deep within me there was a small, unlit room where his memory still lived. Sometimes I would take the box down and simply hold it in my lap, my fingers brushing over the ribbon, feeling the pull of 1,000 unasked questions. I never reread the letters, perhaps because I feared the words would no longer feel as alive as they once had, or perhaps because I knew they would feel exactly the same, and that constancy might undo me. Life without Edward was not without love or happiness, but it was without a certain kind of possibility, the kind that makes you believe the horizon will keep expanding as long as you dare to walk toward it. I told Lily that the years dulled the sharp ache of his absence, but they never erased the shape he left behind. And though I learned to laugh freely and to love the life I had, part of me always knew there was a different version of myself in another time, still standing on the pier beside him, the sea wind in my hair, believing the world was wide enough for us both. Back in the present, Lily sat cross-legged on the living room rug, the box of letters between us, her fingers resting lightly on the ribbon as if she understood the weight of what it held. She looked at me with a steadiness I had only seen in her a handful of times, the kind of gaze that refuses to be turned away, and she told me she wanted to read them all together, from the very first to the last. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying none of the hesitance I had always felt when I thought about opening those envelopes again. She said stories like this shouldn't be buried, that love like this deserved to be heard, and for a moment I could not find my voice. I had spent so many years keeping this part of myself locked away, convincing myself that silence was its own kind of protection, that speaking it aloud would somehow diminish it or invite a sorrow I was no longer strong enough to face. But her insistence was different from the well-meaning questions others had asked over the years. It wasn't born of idle curiosity or a need to romanticize what had happened. It was something deeper, a recognition that this story had shaped me in ways even I had never fully admitted. I felt something shift inside me then, like a door I had kept closed for decades was beginning to creak open, not because I had forced it, but because the air around it had changed. I looked at her and saw not just my granddaughter, but a bridge between the woman I had been and the woman I had become, and I wondered if perhaps the time for silence had finally passed. The thought frightened me in a way I could not quite explain, but it also brought with it a strange kind of relief, like loosening a knot that had been pulling tight for far too long. I told her I wasn't sure if I was ready, that some stories take a lifetime to find the right words. But she smiled in that quiet, determined way she has, and I knew there would be no turning her from this. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently, saying that sometimes the truth needs to be spoken not just for the sake of the one who lived it, but for those who will carry it forward. Her words settled in me like the first light of morning after a long night, and I realized that maybe this was what I had been waiting for all along. Someone who would listen without trying to change the story. Someone who would hold it exactly as it was. I looked down at the box, at the ribbon worn soft by time, and for the first time in years I felt ready to untie it, to let the words inside breathe again in the open air. We spent the afternoon in the living room, the box resting between us on the coffee table, as though it were something fragile and alive. And Lily untied the ribbon with slow, deliberate care, as if she understood that every knot held more than paper inside it. The first envelope she pulled free was thin and pale with age, the ink softened to a faded blue, and when she began to read, her voice was steady at first, each word falling into the quiet air like a pebble into still water. I sat back against the sofa cushions, my hands folded in my lap, and let the sound of Edward's words wash over me, words I had not heard in decades, but knew as intimately as my own breath. There was a moment when she reached a line of such unguarded longing that her voice trembled, and she looked up at me, eyes glistening, before continuing. Hearing his thoughts, spoken aloud after so many years, felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for far too long, the air rushing in with a freshness that was almost dizzying. As she read on, I could see the shape of those days coming back to life, the way the light had fallen across the library floor when I found his first poem, the salt-warmed breeze on the pier at night, the quiet intimacy of knowing someone in ways that defy explanation. Some letters were filled with gentle humour, small observations of the world around him, while others carried the weight of distances that could not be crossed, the ache of missing someone too far away to touch. With each page, I felt myself both lifted and unmoored, pulled back into a time when possibility still shimmered just beyond the horizon. Lily read them slowly, pausing now and then to let the words settle, as if she understood they had been written to be savoured rather than hurried. The room seemed to grow warmer, the afternoon light spilling in golden and soft, and for a while it was as though Edward himself was with us, his presence stitched into the fabric of the space by the cadence of his sentences. I did not speak much, only answered when she asked for the story behind a particular moment or place he had mentioned, my memories unfolding reluctantly at first, and then more freely as the hours passed. We lost track of time, the pile of read letters growing beside her, the unread ones still resting in the box like unopened doors. When she finally set down the last one of the day, there was a stillness between us, not empty, but full, the kind that lingers when something long kept hidden has finally been brought into the light. I realized then that I had not only shared Edward's words with her, but had also let her see the part of myself that had lived quietly alongside them all these years. At last, after hours of reading and remembering, we reached the wax-sealed envelope, the one that had lain at the bottom of the box for more than half a century, its deep red mark still unbroken, though dulled with age. Lily lifted it gently, turning it over in her hands, and asked if I wanted her to open it. My throat felt tight, my heart beating in a way that made me aware of every inch of my skin, and for a moment I thought I might tell her no, that it was better left as it had always been, a mystery I could control. but something in her eyes told me this was the moment I had been circling all day, perhaps all my life. So I nodded, my hands trembling as if they already knew what was about to come. She slid her finger beneath the flap and broke the seal, the faint crack of wax sounding louder than it should, and unfolded the thick paper with the care one might give a fragile relic. She began to read, her voice steady, and the first words banished every expectation I had clung to for decades. It was not goodbye, not the ending I had feared so deeply I could not bear to face it. It was a beginning I had never known was offered to me. Edward wrote of a life he wanted to build with me, asking me to join him overseas, to marry him, to see the world together as we had dreamed on so many moonlit walks. His words were full of hope, of certainty, as if he had no doubt that I would say yes. But near the end he explained that he would be sailing on a certain date, and that if I could come, I should meet him at the harbour before his ship departed. My vision blurred as Lily read the last lines, and I understood in a single, shattering moment why I had never heard him speak of it again. The letter had arrived late, weeks after he had already gone, delayed somewhere in the tangle of the post, and by the time it reached me, I had already convinced myself it carried the ending I could not bear to read. I had placed it in the box, sealing my own fate without ever knowing. All these years I had lived with the belief that he had chosen a different life, when in truth the choice had never been made, at least not by him. The weight of that knowledge settled over me, not as the sharp pain I might have expected, but as a deep, aching quiet, the kind that comes when you finally see the shape of what was lost and realize it was not what you had imagined at all. Lily folded the letter carefully, her hands lingering on the paper, and placed it back in the box, as if returning a heartbeat to its long-forgotten place. I told Lily that there are moments in life when you realize how a single choice, or in my case the absence of one, can alter the entire map of where you end up, and that knowing this is both a wound and a strange kind of gift. The ache of that unopened letter was not only in what it contained, but in the years it had lived in silence, the way it sat quietly at the bottom of the box while my life went on in another direction entirely. I told her that for so long I imagined Edward's absence as the result of a decision he had made, and I built my acceptance on that belief, shaping my days around a version of the truth that had never existed. To know now that he had asked me to join him, to see the world at his side, to marry him, was to see another life flicker into being in my mind, as real in its outlines as the one I had lived, and yet unreachable, like a view seen through glass. It is impossible not to wonder who I would have been in that life, what kind of woman I would have become in foreign cities, what moments we might have shared that I will never know. And yet, as I sat with Lily and felt her hand close over mine, I understood something else too. I had loved and been loved, even if not by him in the way we once imagined. I had held my children in my arms. I had known the steady devotion of a husband who cared for me. I had seen my family grow and fill my home with voices and laughter. That life was not a consolation prize. It was a full and rich thing in its own right, one I would not trade away even now. Gratitude and sorrow can live in the same place, I told her, and they often do. What was lost with Edward was not erased by what I gained, just as what I gained does not make the loss any less real. I could carry both truths without letting one cancel the other. The unopened letter was a reminder of a love that could have been, but my life was a testament to the love that was, and both were worth honouring. I wanted her to understand that we cannot always control the currents that shape our paths, but we can choose how we live with where they take us. As I spoke, I felt the weight of all those years shift slightly, as though sharing it had lessened its hold, and I realized that perhaps Edward's story and mine had always been meant to be told together, not because it was unfinished, but because it had left an imprint that endured alongside everything else I became. Lily, with the kind of resolve that seems stitched into her very bones, began searching for Edward almost as soon as the last letter was returned to the box, her fingers quick over the keys, her eyes narrowing in concentration as though she could will the answers to appear. I told her not to trouble herself, that some things are best left where they rest. But she only smiled faintly, as if she had already decided she would not stop until she knew more. Days turned into weeks, and every so often she would glance up from her laptop with a glimmer of possibility before shaking her head and returning to her search. I tried not to ask, though each click of her keyboard was like a small knock at a door I had locked long ago. Then, one rainy afternoon, she looked up and told me she had found something. Her voice was quiet but certain, the kind of tone that lets you know the truth is about to shift the ground beneath you. She had learned that Edward had passed away 10 years ago, his obituary in a small coastal paper from a town I had never visited. My breath caught, not in surprise exactly, but in the way a wave catches you when you think you are ready for it, knocking you slightly off balance all the same. What stilled me most was not his passing, though that was its own ache, but what she read next. Edward had never married. The obituary spoke of his work, his travels, his dedication to the sea, and of donations made in his name to a maritime museum. Among those donations, carefully noted in the archive, was a box of letters kept in pristine condition, each one from me. He had kept them all his life. The thought of my words, carried with him through decades, oceans, and countless ports, made my chest tighten in a way that was both painful and strangely comforting. I imagined him opening them on lonely nights, perhaps reading by the dim light of a ship's cabin lamp, my handwriting a tether to a time and place we had shared. Lily showed me the museum's website, and there, in a small photograph, was the box, my familiar ribbon tied around it, unchanged, except for the years. It struck me then that while I had kept his letters in silence, hidden away from the world, he had carried mine openly, letting them travel alongside him, silent companions to the life he lived. The knowledge was bittersweet, a mingling of grief for the years we lost, and gratitude that what we had meant enough to him to preserve it so carefully. As I sat there beside Lily, the rain whispering against the windows, I felt the span of our lives like two lines that had run close together, never quite meeting again, yet always aware of each other's course. The decision came quietly, as most important ones often do, not with fanfare or a sudden rush of clarity, but with the slow settling of truth into its rightful place. I looked at the box on my coffee table, its ribbon worn soft from years of being moved and touched and yet never undone without purpose. And I thought of Edward's box sitting in that maritime museum, holding my words as faithfully as I had held his. It seemed only right that they should be together, that the story we wrote in letters and silence should be preserved as one whole instead of two halves kept apart. I told Lily my idea, and her eyes lit with that mixture of joy and understanding that always makes her seem older than her years. She nodded without hesitation, as though she had known from the moment she found the box in the attic that it would not stay here forever. The next morning, I sat with the letters spread before me for the first time in decades, letting my fingers brush the edges, reading small fragments that caught my eye, feeling again the warmth and ache they carried. I tied the ribbon once more, careful and deliberate, and handed the box to Lily. Watching her cradle it in her arms, I felt something shift inside me, a lightness I had not expected, as though releasing it into the world was not a loss, but a kind of completion. She promised to deliver it to the museum, to place it alongside Edward's, and I imagined them together in some quiet display, our handwriting facing one another at last, telling the story of a love that never faded, even as life pulled us along separate paths. Standing in the doorway, I watched her walk to the car, the late afternoon sun catching her hair, and it struck me that I was giving her something far greater than a box of old letters. I was giving her the truth of who I had been before I was her grandmother, showing her that love is not made lesser by its ending, and that the pieces we carry with us, even the ones shaped by absence, can still hold beauty and meaning. I thought of the visitors who might one day pause before those two boxes, reading our words, perhaps seeing their own reflections in them, and I hoped they would understand that what we had was not defined by its incompletion, but by the way it endured in memory and in the written word. As the car pulled away and I turned back into my quiet house, I felt the echo of Edward's presence, not as a longing, but as a gentle certainty that our story had found its final resting place, not in secrecy or silence, but in the open air where it could belong to the world, and in the heart of a granddaughter who would carry it forward.